everybody. I'm Keith Kirkpatrick, Research Director with the Futurum Group, and I'd like to welcome you to Enterprising Insights. It's our weekly podcast that explores the latest developments in the enterprise software market and the technologies that underpin those platforms, applications, and tools. So this week, we're going to take a deep dive into SaaS pricing, and one of the key drivers of pricing over the next several years, which is the integration of artificial intelligence into those platforms. Then we're going to, of course, close out our show with our Rant or Rave segment, where we pick one item in the market and we'll either champion it or criticize it. So I'd like to welcome back Mark Beccue. He is a research director for artificial intelligence at the Futurum Group. He has more than a decade covering artificial intelligence and some of the underlying technology approaches. And he also has the distinction of being my first co-host for Enterprising Insights. So welcome back, Mark.
Hi, Keith. How you doing?
I'm doing well. And you?
Very good.
Good. Well, why don't we just get right back into it here? Taking a look at the various pricing models that are being used for SaaS platforms. So as we're both familiar, there are a few different approaches that are being used by vendors in the market. You have sort of this flat rate pricing where it's sort of a set amount for a product or service over a given time period, essentially your subscription model. And, it seems like the vendors really like this because it's a predictable flow of revenue. And if you'd like, you can actually segment your customers by different tiers. So if you have 3 specific tiers, you can break those out based upon specific target groups or just by increasing the amount of functions there. So some easy examples are Dropbox. They use that sort of a model. Microsoft Office 365 does that. MailChimp, that sort of thing. And of course, going along with that, we also have feature-based pricing. So again, you're kind of dividing up the offering into different tiers based on feature sets. And here it's sort of like if you want to target specific segments that value some feature set over another, you can segment those users and then, of course, create a targeted revenue plan. So if you have some users that are very, very focused on, let's say, access to a large amount of data storage, you might create a plan where the pricing is advantageous to the vendor while giving benefits to that user. Then, of course, you could have another tier where it's about specific features. So all of these different approaches are really designed to create benefits for both the vendor as well as for the end user. A couple others that are common are user-based pricing, which is commonly referred to as seat licenses. And then, of course, the one that I really like to kind of dive into is this pay-as-you-go or usage model, where customers are charged based upon the usage of that software. And again, that could be based on the number of transactions, the amount of resource used, or really any kind of other metric that's relative to that software. So I really want to kind of dive into this, Mark, in terms of how is AI starting to really kind of impact the way that vendors are thinking about pricing. And certainly, we've seen some, vendors that have come right out and said, we're going to incorporate generative AI technology and we're going to charge a premium on top of whatever pricing model we already have.
Yeah, it's easy to say that it's early days, right? I mean, we're really in an experimentation place. I really think, you've mentioned before that you have cost drivers, you have that you have to account for, obviously. And I just really think there's a lot of experimentation. They don't know. I really don't think they know. But they're kind of trying to balance what that cost might be at you're looking for a profitable piece. Some of them might be doing more of a baked in approach, I would guess, so I mean, we could talk about this as you go through the questions, but what if it's something that let's say your feature of a product and it's kind of embedded, why would you charge more for that, right? It's really kind of more of a competitive advantage to the SaaS player, and I think there's a lot of that already. We you and I've talked about that before. There's a lot of people, they're not charging for this. They're thinking it's a competitive advantage.
Right. Right. Well, Mark, why don't we take a step back here? Because you mentioned something pretty interesting. Is there is obviously a cost component, particularly when we're thinking about things like generative AI. What kind of goes into that in terms of why is there even a cost associated with generative AI?
Yeah. So that's been the white elephant in the room, isn't it? The big elephant in the room has been, wherever you say that, gorilla, elephant,
Yeah.
big thing.
Right. Right.
Um, you know, what we don't really know is what is the cost of AI compute
Okay.
associated with these products, and how do you parse it
Mm-hmm.
out? And
Mm-hmm.
you know, I don't think the market was served very well by kind of the free models that we saw early on from ChatGPT and those kinds of things, where the cost, you're not necessarily reflecting cost because it's free, right, to do
Mm-hmm.
something, but the compute loads are massive, and it doesn't matter if you might have heard, I've talked again about whether it's training, which is the one that is really eye-popping for how much that compute is, but really inference, which is the everyday AI kind of run workloads, are not small. So,
Right.
you know, it kind of depends on what goes into it, but all of these SaaS players are having to look at their cost basis, and I think the biggest one is the compute load at this point.
Really. Okay. But I have to imagine though when we're talking about AI and in particular generative AI, uh, there a cost associated with the training portion, particularly when you're going and you're looking at it and saying, I'm not just going to use this, open AI model. I'm actually going to be, whether it's tuning my model or, grounding it in, a specific corpus of data. I assume that there are some costs there, particularly when we get into, very, very specific types of functions as opposed to just, you
Right.
know, using OpenAI to type in something,
Right.
on Bard or something like that.
Absolutely. That's what I meant. Is the training parts are don't happen all the time, right? So you
Yeah.
typically are not going to train a model constantly, right? That's every once in a while. You
Right.
think about the kind of the cycles that Chat GPT does through, because we know that cycle. It's like, well, here's GPT 5 or 4 or 3, and that's when they're
Right.
regenerating things. So it's not all the time, right? The one
Hmm.
that's really the day to day kind of heavy, the day to day load is really the inference piece.
Okay.
So yeah, there's certainly the scary part about these models are, where do we go? But I will say this, and this will impact the SaaS players absolutely. There has been, you've seen how it's mutated, how there's
Yeah.
efficiencies. There's a lot of what I call, like hacks and things where
Right.
you're really getting these models more efficiently run, whether
Right.
it's kind of a hack to do that, fine tuning is a way, RAG is a way, smaller models is a way, right? So you're not running such big loads. So there's that
Hmm.
morph. And then
Yep.
you have, I think within the data centers, you're getting better. We're getting more purpose-driven AI chips are coming. Instead of
Yep.
just GPUs, they're thinking about how to run those things more efficiently. So everybody's pushing towards driving costs down for compute.
Right. Well, kind of digging into that a little bit, it sounds like the idea is to, figure out a way to optimize this. So if you're there's no reason to use a large language model for some very specific use cases. And I would assume that, both in terms of the actual AI providers as well as the SaaS providers are going to be looking at ways to really make sure that they deploy generative AI in the most efficient way possible because to your second point about, it's really the inference and the number of hits every time you go out to try to do something that's going to run up cost.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the one that gets a little tricky, and you talk about use cases,
Hmm.
lots of really very pragmatic use cases for the SaaS players. The ones that are the heaviest load are really those
Hmm.
assistants. right? So
Yep.
when you're doing that, they got to retrain. The inference is heavy. Um,
Hmm.
so I'm wondering about how far we go. What happens with those for SaaS players, and those are actually, to your point, I think those are the ones that they'll end up trying to. We've already seen that they will charge for, and that makes sense because it's more of a high cost run.
Right, because I think, if you look at whether we're talking about what Microsoft is doing with Copilot or, ServiceNow, any of these vendors, and now, of course, Amazon has kind of gotten into the game with Q, uh, that seems like there's a real potential for a lot of usage because every time you want to summarize a conversation, every time you're looking for a, prediction or a suggestion, that's essentially, you're looking at real dollars and cents there.
Yeah, and to me, you and I talked a lot about these leaders in SaaS space, and I kind of look to Salesforce as an interesting uh, kind of example of, the Einstein assistants are purpose built more, right? So they're
Yep.
not like general purpose; they're really more specific, and that
Yeah.
makes sense to me. I think that that's easier for the SaaS player to say, "This is what this does. Here's what you
Hmm.
can do with it, and we're going to
Right.
charge you this for that," right? When it's kind of
Right.
a queue or those kinds of things, and we've seen what I think Microsoft's admitted that the $30 charge is a test. And by the way, that's on enterprise only. They haven't
Right.
figured what they're going to do with consumer yet. But like we said up front, is that going to stick? We're not sure.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I know both you and I cover Adobe fairly
Hmm.
extensively, and the interesting thing there is if you look at what they're doing with generative AI, particularly within their creative cloud, if you were to say use generative AI to, basically, type in a text prompt to create an image, you could be really, that's an interesting sort of use case there because you could wind up going down a rabbit hole. And I know that in talking with them, they've taken the approach of sort of, being like a candy vendor with kids. Like, let's give out a little taste, let's get you hooked on it, and then we'll kind of figure out if you're going back to that candy store every day, 18 times a day. Then they'll have to figure out a way to charge it. But it seems like what they're trying to do, and some of these other vendors as well, as you mentioned on the consumer side, are saying, hey, let's get people using this, demonstrate the benefits, and then we'll worry about actually matching that
Right.
pricing to actual costs.
Right.
Um,
In-app purchase, right?
yeah, exactly,
um,
exactly.
some of this gets tricky to me because there's so much more to this than pricing. You know, I think of Adobe, and you and I both agree that just one of the better AI thinkers, AI innovators, period.
Yeah.
They thought about, and if you take it back all the way, let's say they found a very compelling use case, let's say for
Right.
Firefly, right? So that made so much
Mhm.
sense to kind of, streamline the workloads for uh, creatives, marketers, whoever it is that's using those kinds of tools. And they really thought through it well. So, if it comes to the pricing part, it's like, well, they want to try it. But I think what's driving that business, and they've told us, both of us, that this is really showing, a lot of pickup and some lift. That it's because it's such a compelling use case and the value is there. So,
Right.
I think they're gonna get. It really kind of depends on how valuable it is, right? So at the end of the day, it's like,
Mhm.
well, there's price, but it's like, is it worth it? Looks like in their
Right.
case, it would be.
Right. But if you contrast that with, let's go back to those assistants again, which are very, very intensive in terms of, every time you get a recommendation, boom, that's, I guess we talked a little bit about potentially some vendors going to that consumption model every time they, that the model is hit, it costs something. I think the jury's still out on how effective that really is based on, what is the expertise level of the worker that you're assisting. If you're brand new into a job, of course these things are going to help you because you don't have that months or years or whatever of experience. If you've been in a particular role or job for a long time, my sense is that, you're going to know a lot of the stuff. Will it save a little bit of time to do a summarization? Maybe, maybe not.
Right.
I think the jury's still out there.
For sure, it's, just because we don't know how valuable these services will be. And
Right.
so I think but if you go back and kind of look at kind of historically what happens with pricing is, you kind of have entry level thinking, then you kind of have this kind of premium price for a little while, and then it kind of settles
Right.
down because there's scale of all
Yep.
types. There's competition, which drives down the price. So, with this stuff, I think we're going to see the same ideas. It doesn't change it it's not any different, right? It's when these vendors are able to get to scale, price comes down. So does that mean they change the model? Probably.
Right. Well, I think I think we can kind of see that happening not only with, technology, but you look at, or software or anything like that. You look at any kind of technology, you look at the cars that we buy today, there are all of these ADAS features that when they were initially introduced, you had to pay extra. Now it's like, ABS brakes. Every car has them. You don't even think about it,
Right.
until you hit a puddle and wind up careening into a barrier. So I guess to kind of wrap up this section, I guess the big question is, how far are we away from achieving that scale where it becomes, generative AI is not something that we're chatting about endlessly here. It's just part of a SaaS platform and it's kind of baked in.
Yeah, I think it's a couple of years, but I'm going to give that as a qualification because I think you and I both have again discussed the pace of innovation in the space and the mutation has been,
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen anything even close. How quickly, and for example, how quickly those models have morphed
Mm-hmm.
to this idea. It's mind numbing. It's head spinning. You could put any kind
Yeah.
of thing in there. So, but that it takes time. I think that the pace of innovation is so good across the ecosystem that there's good chances these are going to come down pretty quickly. Probably
Mm-hmm.
the toughest part has to do with the chips because those cycles to development are so long, right?
Right.
There's been awful lot of investment, by the bigger players, from AMD to Intel to NVIDIA themselves, or they've just put out a new chip that's even more efficient than the last ones they were doing, even though they're not purpose built for AI. Those GPUs. So
Right.
a ton Qualcomm. That's a really interesting thing. So there's another little monkey wrench for all this is if the SaaS players start to think about on-device AI. So let's say it
Right.
runs a different kind of models, right? Much smaller
Mm-hmm.
offline. Well, that changes the game too. So
Right.
we'll see what happens,
Right.
right?
Yeah, well, that begs another question, which is, and I know you've covered this pretty extensively, looking at, let's say on your phone you have on-device AI. Then the question is, who adopts that, given that you're going to have power issues as well and
Right.
power demands. There's a lot of stuff that's still kind of,
A lot of stuff.
up in the air, up in the air. So. Well, I'm sure we could go on forever about this, and I want to kind of put a marker here of let's check back in let's say 6 months
Hmm.
and see where we are, because I suspect that the world will look quite different than even right now,
No doubt.
based on what you're saying about pace of innovation.
Yeah.
So, in the few minutes we have left, I want to again move to our rant or rave section here. And of course, for anyone who hasn't been following along, this is where I throw out a topic, and you get a couple of minutes to either rant or rave about it. Now, because you are our internal generative AI guru, I wanted to talk to you about, how companies, whether we're, generally SaaS companies, are positioning or trying to differentiate themselves based on the generative AI, whether it's the assistants they use or whatever functionality. And one of the things that's really interesting is that they seem to keep talking about the amount of data that they have that they train their models on, and they're saying that we have more data than any other vendor. That's why our AI is better than XYZ vendor. And the thing that's really kind of that I'm going to rant a little bit here is I feel like it's hard to prove that unless you're doing just like a one-to-one vendor comparison. And honestly, I'm wondering if that's even, is that really the thing that enterprise buyers should be doing is comparing based on just on training data, the amount of training data, or are there other factors that really, they should be looking at?
Right. Yeah. I think the rant would be we're in an education stage very much, really, and you have to depend
Mm-hmm.
on these companies that understand this to navigate that space. That's why we have in our show, it's called the Adults in the AI Rumpus Room. We like to talk about people who are leaders and thought leaders in the space, but it's such an education process that's needed. They need to think about this. Now there's a friction and within all companies between marketing and the pragmatics of what actually happens. So sometimes
Right.
I think we're getting in the rant side just this a lot of FOMO about generative AI in
Yeah.
general and getting left behind, and we've got generative AI and all that kind of stuff. So setting that aside, um, what I think is going to happen, and there's some interesting thinkers around this, is that all these models are new to us, but
Okay.
they're going to be commoditized. It's the models don't make a difference, and they're not a differentiating factor for
Mm-hmm.
enterprises at the end of the day. What is going to
Okay.
be the differentiator is how they use, let's call it proprietary data, right?
Yep.
Not training, not like large language training, but what they do and how they leverage all this proprietary data that they might have. So again,
Mm-hmm.
Salesforce talks about this. Adobe talks about this. There's others in the SaaS space
Right.
that do. So how they leverage that, that's the I think that's the words we use, is what are we doing with your data to make this more personalized, more relevant to you. The outcomes are something that company now does and leverages that puts them as a differentiator with what they're doing.
Right. I guess my rant kind of centers on the fact that, we are hearing from a lot of vendors saying they are trying to do that. I'm
Right.
looking for, I guess, a more specific answer. And also, one of the things that some vendors have done a pretty good job about is saying, look, we're not trying to use generative AI over every single thing. And we are focusing on, these specific industries and these specific use cases and making sure that this is where we're putting our resources. We may not be able to, do every single, potential use case or every particular industry out there, but the ones that we're going to focus on, we're going to do well because that's where our expertise is. And really, as you said, making sure that they're able to provide real outcomes,
Right.
from this data.
Yeah. Maybe if I backtrack a little bit, for SaaS, this is a little different than maybe the kind of the trend right now, and it makes sense, is that let's say you're an enterprise, that enterprise, not a
Hmm.
SaaS, is
Right.
wants to leverage their data, right? So how they use generative AI is how, that kind of thing. So these SaaS players, their hands are a little tied, right, as far as how much data they can ingest that these customers will give them, right?
Right.
And that also, to your point, begs the question that how much are they exposing that it's specific to the SaaS, right? Usually, it's not. Well, this is all our general data. It's a PII, and our ERP stuff, and on it goes.
Yeah.
So I think there's some players in the space that maybe will look for signs, maybe like SAP, to see, because they're more general purpose in their SaaS approach, maybe. So then they know about they're good at AI. So it'll be interesting to see if how that works out.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I think like all this, it's there's a lot of stuff that's still to be decided over time. So, all right. Well, again, thank you very much, Mark, for joining me here on Enterprising Insights. Everyone out there, make sure that you tune into Mark's podcast as well, called the AI Moment. Next time here on Enterprising Insights, we're going to be doing a year-end wrap-up in the enterprise software market. And I'll have a couple of other guests to join me to keep this webcast as lively and interactive as possible. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on your preferred platform. Thanks, and see you next time.